Amy, when we were at Fiction Addiction last week, Jill Hendricks and I were talking about this episode, which is all about sports stories. And Jill told me something she had read. Sports stories are the hardest stories to write.
Yeah. I heard you and Jill talking. I thought that was very interesting, but I didn't catch all of it. Why are sports stories some of the hardest to write?
Because we already know the end of the story before the storyteller ever gets started.
I gotcha. Okay. Well, I guess I hadn't really considered that to be a difficulty in writing.
Here's something I have thought about, though. Why are sports stories so inspiring and heartwarming, even to people who don't like sports?
Well, I love the stories behind how athletes got to the Olympics or others that demonstrate overcoming obstacles. Well, here's another question, though. Why do sports stories carry so much power to create social change?
Well, to answer those questions, we've brought together two storytellers and sports lovers, Dr. Tom LeGrand of Greenville, South Carolina, and Mr. Brendan Scott of Denver, Colorado.
Welcome, guys.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. Tom left Gardner-Webb University, where he worked in service learning and taught social entrepreneurship and innovation in order to take care of ailing family members and friends. He recently accepted an opportunity to serve as the regional director of the Carolinas for Impact America, which is very similar to the service learning initiatives he initiated at Gardner-Webb. Tom also has experience in radio broadcasting, podcasting, and writing. And from 2010 to 2012, Tom co-hosted the Lettermen's Lounge, a sports podcast that covered local, national, and international athletics. It's a subsidiary of Jungle Gym Sports. Tom, tell us about what you're working on.
Right now, we are working with Impact America, as you said, and the focus of that organization is to get recent college graduates out into service projects in North and South Carolina. So we connect AmeriCorps workers through Focus First, which is an eye screening initiative for younger children and kindergarten-age children, particularly in underserved areas, trying to make sure that they are getting proper eye care and eyewear as they need it. The other one, and I really am a huge fan of this initiative, is called Save First, which is directed towards doing tax returns for underserved communities and helping them to not be charged exorbitant rates and exorbitant fees for having their taxes done. Sometimes even the people we work with are not good readers, or they certainly don't understand. I don't understand tax codes. I have a doctorate. Most tax people don't understand tax codes. They've been trained in it. Mm-hmm. So we are there to make sure that they get the full benefit of their tax return. And we do, for free, work with Furman, Wofford, Claflin College down in Orangeburg. And their accounting departments will come out and help us fill out returns for people. So I'm a huge fan of that because we'll talk on another show about my problems with predatory lending, which is kind of a new personal focus of mine these days. But that's what we're doing right now.
That's awesome. And Tom and Tracy was on our podcast earlier in the years talking about middle grade novels and social issues. So very excited to have Tom with us.
Tom and Tracy what?
LeGrand.
They're married?
Yes, they are.
Oh, okay.
Last time we checked.
Tracy, if you're listening to this, you better be laughing.
Well, the other thing about that, I'm just giving you the heads up. Tracy's a lot smarter than I am. So whatever you got out of her, just dial it down a notch, all right? So that's kind of the way we have to do this.
Setting expectations.
There you go. All right. Well, Brendan Scott earned a degree in English from the University of Colorado and then traveled to Guatemala, where he taught writing, English, and physical education for 3 years at the Inter-American School of Shayla, thank you. After returning to the U.S., Brendan earned a master's degree in English education at Regis University and began teaching high school English. He also coaches the women's basketball team at Jefferson High School. Brendan recently married April, a librarian, after proposing to her on a trip to Harry Potter World. He blogs at Living Spiritually and Adventure with Brendan. He is also claiming to be our first fan to be on our podcast. So welcome, Brendan. What are you up to?
All right. So, the school year started last week, and I am currently knee-deep I would say waist deep probably tomorrow, teaching my students all about memoirs. So that's the art form of writing about yourself, which is kind of what I practice with my Adventure with Brendan blog. And so, like, when I blog, which has been very rare lately, it's when I forget that I need to be perfect with all of my writing and I let myself go. And so that's what I'm trying to teach my students right now, is just kind of tell the story about your life. And, I really find that it's the best way to connect with my students early on. What I found is when I get them into writing about themselves, they open up, they get vulnerable, they share a little bit. Then through the year, I can go, hey, I know you. I know that you went through this. Let's talk about it. There's something going on. And it just creates this bond in our classroom. And I love that. And so that's why after I left Guatemala, I was like, I got to keep teaching. I've got to keep being in the classroom so that I can connect with my students. And then I'm also helping build the cross-country team at my school. So not only do I coach girls basketball, but this year our school said, hey, we've got enough people to do cross-country. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. Because one thing I love is running, and I kind of came into that later in my mid-20s. And so I'm trying to teach them that, you don't have to be great at something at first, but you can learn to love something. And so I'm building the cross-country team and facing a challenge of changing their minds, because they're all like, no, it's hard, mister. I don't want to run. And I'm like, well, yeah, it is hard. But when do we want to just say, well, it's hard, I'm not going to try it? Because that's not going to let us get anywhere. So, yeah, that's where I'm at.
Well, interestingly, I saw that you're a women's basketball coach.
Yeah.
Okay. I learned as a church league girls basketball coach for 8th grade girls, you cannot coach girls the way you coach guys. Would you say that's true, or has that changed some?
That is completely true. And here's how my interview went to be able to coach girls basketball. They said, hey, what experience do you have coaching? I was like, well, I played middle school basketball with my church league. And they're like, you're hired.
Done.
It's just, they're desperate and they need you. And it's been a great experience.
Good deal.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate the fact that you are using storytelling in your classroom. And I agree with you. It has such a far-reaching effect. We can't really get into the hearts and minds of our students or really anyone in our lives if we don't know their story. And we all come to the table with a story. So I appreciate you doing that. All right, well, let's get right into this topic. An article in the New York Times lamented that sports stories were mostly about moral narratives and not about hard data. But the article went on to say there are still emotional and existential lessons that can be summoned by the sight of men and women chasing a ball around a field. So why are sports stories so often narratives about justice or ethics or morality and not just about what happened on the field or on the rink or on the court? What do you think, Tom?
This is a difficult question to answer for a couple of reasons. I find it difficult to answer. Now, Brenda may breeze right through it, but nonetheless, first of all, there is hard data about sports that tells us that students who are engaged in some type of athletic activity typically do better in school, typically are less engaged. And now I know we have all the narratives about the partying football players and this kind of stuff, but typically they are not in trouble as much. They are more focused. I know the swim team at Gardner-Webb, I always loved it when I had swim team students in class, because they were laser focused. I mean, they just did great at everything if they were awake from their 4 a.m. practice. But anyway, I have one poor little freshman girl, her first semester, and she just struggled to stay awake.
Yeah.
Because she had been up and swam, 7 miles that morning or something like that. But I think there is good data to tell us that these stories are positive experiences for a lot of people who play. The narratives about justice and ethics and morality, though, they get a little bit convoluted as the story is told. And I'm going to save some of that for the second question because it plays into some of the movie narratives that we see. But I think we all like a story about somebody overcoming, somebody being able to beat the odds. Now, sometimes we Hollywood that up a little bit too much, and it benefits you. I would recommend for people go back and read the book after you've watched the movie. If you watch the movie first, that sometimes gives you a better story. But I think it just inspires us to think somebody can overcome that. Too often, some of the best sports stories don't get told. There was one a few years ago about a young man who was playing nose guard for a football team and his legs were cut off at the knees. And he was managing to play nose guard on the football field. And a coach actually went and protested to the league that he had an unfair advantage because he could get lower than all the other players.
Oh, my goodness.
And my thought on that was, if I was a coach and I had to tell my players that they were at a disadvantage because a guy had no legs, I think I would just quit coaching and step away and be like, I'm not a very good football coach. But and I would like to see some more of those real type stories come in, not even the ones that are beefed up a little bit for the purposes of making it a better story. I think there are plenty of them out there. And just about kids putting in the time and effort and energy to do it. You do not work your way through college on an athletic scholarship at most colleges without working. I mean, it is work. Most schools do not have hyperbaric sleep chambers in their locker rooms for their players. They have to go to class and they have to show up and they have to behave and all those other kind of things. So I would like to see us get back to maybe some more realistic stories about these athletes if we could go forward.
What about you, Brendan?
All right. So first off, Tom, amen to the fact that if you are an athlete, you tend to do better because you have more adults in your life. You are just fed into by your coaches, by the other parents that are a part of the program. And what we tell our students, and this is one of the reasons why I said, hey, I'm going to jump into coaching when I finally was able to, you are able to say, hey, this kid is part of this program. They have to have their grades up. And because of that, we're going to help them. We're going to get tutoring for them. And not just that, then because they're at school after school, obviously that was a little redundant, but I'm an English teacher, and gosh, I write better than I speak sometimes. But they're at school. They're not home doing whatever. They're not out doing drugs. They're not causing problems. They're part of something that's going to build their confidence. And so, amen to what you said there, Tom. I want to approach this question out of what the article in the New York Times is lamenting, that stories were mostly about moral narratives and not about hard data. I want to start that first because as an English teacher, fiction is near and dear to my heart. I absolutely love a good story. And so I want to start off with a quote that I have up on my wall in my classroom. It says, "Fiction is the lie that tells the truth." And it's from Neil Gaiman. And what Neil Gaiman is saying is that we have an obligation not to bore our readers, but to make them need to turn the page. And then he says, one of the best cures for a reluctant reader, after all, is a tale they cannot stop themselves from reading. And so I think if fiction is the lie that tells the truth, a good sports story that is well written is the truth that tells the truth. And so, while I used to sit up at night and add up my favorite running back's yardage while I was in middle school, so Terrell Davis was, is a Hall of Fame running back, and in the 1990s, he was just lighting the field on fire. In the year after we won the Super Bowl, he was going for 2,000 yards, and so I would lie in my bed and just go, okay, if he gets 200 yards, next game he'll be here. He'll have 1,100 yards total. And if he does this, he's on pace to get to 2,000 yards. And I was super psyched. It wasn't because of the data, though, that got me psyched for him. It was because the year before, when he was playing in the Super Bowl, he played with a migraine. Now, all of my life, I've dealt with migraines. And so when I found out that he dealt with migraines too, I connected to him. And so what Neil Gaiman is saying when he's talking about fiction is the lie that tells the truth. He's talking about the idea that when we read fiction, we're seeing the truth in life, and then that fiction allows us to build empathy. And so when Terrell Davis went back in after having to sit out a quarter, played with a migraine, scored the go-ahead touchdown, I was like, well, wait a second. If he can play with a migraine, maybe I can make it through life with migraines too. And so that's why I think so many sports stories need to be stories and not just data. They need to help us build that empathy. Because as humans, we long to connect to people, to learn and grow, and I don't think that if we're looking just at data, in a sports column, that we're really connecting to that human element in those sports stories. So if you go back to the question and you're looking at why is it all moral, why is it justice and ethics, it's because sports stories have a chance to teach us how to be better humans. They have a chance to teach us how to say, oh, I saw that person struggle. They might not look like me, but I've gone through that too. And I can say, wait, me too. So, with Trell Davis, I was moved by the fact that he went back in, and it gave me hope. It said, me too. And so that's why I think it's really important to have the ability in sports stories to connect with all types of people, whether it's a kid reading and going, wow, they went through that dealing with justice or ethics, and they go, they made it through, I can do that too. That's why we got to have sports stories that deal with that.
That's a great point from the standpoint, too, that there are lies, darn lies, and statistics. And statistics don't tell the story when it comes to athletic competition. The guys on the offensive line, or being an offensive lineman, I'm a little partial to that group, but, there are no stats on them other than how many holding calls they got called. But if you don't have them, your team does not win. The player who sets the picks and who, does the little things, getting the loose ball and throwing it back inbounds on the basketball team. The swimmer who finished fourth, but they needed her to finish fourth in order for the team to win the overall competition. So there's an element of sports that just statistics just can't touch. And I think that's true in life. Anecdotal data is important as well as hard data. And it's not an either or, it's a both and for those. And I think when we look at sports stories, yes, we need to hear the story of the guy who caught 8 million passes and ran for 40,000 yards or whatever the case may be. But we also need to know about those guys, particularly in the NFL. Yes, you have the $20 million quarterback, but you got the $250,000 special teams guy who's running down and getting his head cracked open every time he goes down the field. Yeah. In order to try to make a living. So there's just more to it than numbers. And if you focus on the numbers, I think Brendan is 100% right. You're missing a large part of the story.
To go back to what Neil Gaiman was getting at, because as an English teacher, I get a lot of pushback on what I teach in my classroom. And I love bringing in books that kids love. And so that's where I get after you want to find a book for that reluctant reader that they can't stop reading. And sometimes the instructional coaches at my school go, well, why aren't you just doing, straight facts? Because, boys need the nonfiction text. And while sports stories typically are nonfiction, they need to be written like they're stories. They need to be written like they're fiction, where there's conflict, there's doubt that the player will succeed. And so I try to pick out in my class stories that have conflict, have doubt, and have possibilities that there isn't going to be success. And so, when I look at that, let's just have it be data. And this is really what bugs me when I'm in the classroom and, other people try to say, well, you need to be teaching this book, and they discount whatever book I've selected. And it's typically on the fiction to nonfiction level, because some people don't connect with well-told stories. They think, well, it needs to be magazines. It needs to be journal articles. And you go, well, when was the last time you read a article or journal article and you're like, ooh, that was not just informative, because sometimes we read those things that are informative, but that was the most interesting. Well, I just couldn't put it down. Typically, when we read journal magazines, we read them for a little bit, we put them back down, we go back to them, because as adults, we've kind of learned that we need to get some information. We need to have some studies that we can go back to, but they're not the most interesting reads.
I don't know what you're talking about. I think journal entries are just fascinating. I read them and eat them up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever. All right. It's getting a little thick. What was that? Darn lies?
Because I know people read my journal articles
Of
like that,
course,
right?
Of course. Your
yeah,
blog
naturally.
is on fire.
Yeah, and you see how many citations I put in those too, don't you?
Well, thinking about it, there are other ways to tell stories besides books. I think about sports movies, 41, The Blind Side, Remember the Titans, and Rudy, and A League of Their Own. A lot of those movies weren't blockbusters when they were released, but they have a lot of staying power and people tend to love them over time. Are sports stories more consistent than other kinds of narratives?
I'm going to let Brenda take that first.
All right. So, Holland, I think you missed out on one of my favorites. It's called McFarland USA. It's newer. It's actually one of the reasons why I was like, I want to do cross country too. But yes, I think they are more consistent because, in a way, sports stories teach resilience. Most of the time, a sports story is all about the underdog against all odds and they overcome, or someone who grew up in poverty but was given a chance to run and now, they have made the American dream, if you want to go to that literature element. But they're all about resilience of some sort of another. And so that's where I think they are way more consistent than many others. Because if you look at other genres, it can be about anything. But most of the time, that main theme in the sports story is that athlete going to overcome?
Right. Excellent point.
I'm going to push back on that a little bit. And first of all, let me ask, did you mean 42?
42, yeah, not 41.
Yeah. Jackie Robinson?
Yeah,
I had a different one in there. She added 42.
I have a typo in there.
I'm just making sure of that because my daughter will have a stroke if she thinks we were talking about Jackie Robinson's movie and we didn't get it right. So
Yes,
42,
42.
honey. Okay, 42.
42, absolutely.
Sorry, Tom's daughter.
Well, Abby's a stickler for those kind of
Yeah,
things. So
absolutely.
I just read what was put in front of me.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Blame the editor.
I was trying to remember, is there a movie 41? Did I
No,
miss
it's
one
42.
somewhere? Okay, that's okay, Amy. It
Thank
happens to
you.
the best of us.
Thank you.
Here's my pushback on that. I think correctly so, the consistency in sports stories as far as the story of the overcomer. What we have seen in sports movies is that they have fudged that to a degree in order to make it a story of overcomers. For example, Remember the Titans is largely untrue. Now, there are good points to be drawn from that story. There are good points about racial reconciliation, but the story was very much untrue. It was far from what actually happened. The story of Rudy has been fudged a little bit over the years. And in fact, Rudy did some jail time later on in life for tax evasion and some other shady things. The Blind Side and Friday Night Lights are two that come to mind. I read the book Friday Night Lights and saw the movie. Now, the movie was kind of inspirational. I think it was inspirational from a standpoint of understanding the pressure on players and some of these little one-horse towns that everything is wrapped around the high school football team. But there were also some very serious racial implications of that movie that in the book were brought out in a very different way. And H.G. Bissinger's book, I think, actually tells a much more accurate story of what happened than the movie. So sometimes I think in the telling of stories through the movie version, we almost take it a little too far to push a certain narrative to keep it consistent.
Sure.
And let's face it, that's probably going to sell better than the true story of what happens. But we also have to be careful not to push a narrative that can actually be negative if you take some of those implications. And The Blind Side has been widely criticized for some of the racial implications and some other things going on there. Now, at the same time, we can also point to how that creates opportunities for some conversation.
Sure.
And one of the great things that sports narratives and that sports as a whole do is create the opportunity for conversations about race and gender and all the other issues that we're facing. I just think that sometimes on the first look, maybe we don't see all that. But then when we get to studying the data, if you will, we find out that there's more to the story than what's first revealed.
Right, and that's the both and. That's what you were talking about earlier. That's it can't be one or the other. And I think that's true with just about any book. Once the playwright, the movie director gets a hold of it, the producer, it morphs into something different. And sometimes that's a good thing. And I think, again, in our other episode with propaganda and perspective, follow the money. You got to do your research. Be good at following up on that. So I think both of you have really excellent points on that.
That's what I was just about to say, is it's all perspective because it's the story you want to tell. And so that's what I'm teaching my students with their memoirs, is memoirs, even when you read those, they're not all the truth. That's not everything that happened at all.
It's the truth as you see it.
Or as you want the reader to see it.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
If I know I'm writing it for my teacher to read it, I'm going to write what I want my teacher to believe about me, not what maybe actually is true about me.
Or maybe you're the kid that was on the field and you were playing the game and you want it to sound awesome, when in fact no one was in the crowd, all of that type of stuff. So you spin that story your own way because you want to get a message across. And so I think, looking at books that get written about sports and movies, they're doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Well, when we look back, we can see alignment between great sports stories and larger social movements. I'm thinking of the 1936 Summer Olympics in Germany with the Nazis and how they used propaganda, where Jesse Owens was a black athlete and he also won 4 gold medals. So, Tom, first, what do sports stories tell us about our time and our culture?
Wow. That is a loaded question these days.
Yes, it is.
And part of the loaded nature of that question, I think the first thing we have to go to is the Colin Kaepernick episodes, where he was kneeling in protest of something, and that has taken people to a place where, and I have friends, I will never watch the NFL again. They're terrible. They're horrible for doing this. Yet in NBA basketball, where players have a much larger voice regarding social justice issues, you almost never hear fans talking about that. When players wear T-shirts that say, "I can't breathe," on them after the Eric Garner incidents in New York. So there are different cultures to different sports.
Yeah, excellent point.
I thought about that.
I think that we have to recognize that football is an almost religious culture. We go to the Mecca every Saturday. We sit in the stands with our team colors on, and we expect everyone to. It's the ultimate team sport, so we all toe the line to win the game, and we're focused on that. However, I think we're way past that in sports. I think we're past the point where we can say we just want our guys to go play ball and not have anything to say, because sports are too integrated into the culture in monetarily and in so many, like you said, movies, books, high schools and colleges, parents forking out thousands of dollars for their kids to be able to play volleyball or whatever the case may be. So I think sports is a place where people can really speak into the culture. Jesse Owens winning in those Olympics, Jack Johnson winning the heavyweight title as a black man, as an African American, that changed things. Jackie Robinson changed things. Now, the ultimate change took a long time, but somewhere it had to begin, and you find avenues to do that through sports. And I think when sports can be a positive influence on the culture, they should be. And I am for players speaking out more. Because, I'm going to save that because I know we got some other questions about that. But I think we can look at sports as a microcosm, not of what was, but maybe of what is to come. I think that what happened with Jackie Robinson was a foreshadowing of what was coming to the rest of the country. Now, it's hard to see that in that time and place, but we recognize that this change was on the way. And this was, if it could happen in baseball, it could happen anywhere. And so you kind of get a look to the future. And it also tells us something about ourselves when we look back and say, why did we make a big deal out of that? Why was that such a problem? Or why was that such an issue? I also think it's a great equalizer, particularly on issues of race, learning to overcome whatever differences you have, because you got to get out there on the field and perform. Whether you like the person next to you, whether you like his race or his politics or whatever it is, when you get out there, you kind of put that to the side. And I think it helps you maybe do that a little bit in your normal life.
Yeah. Bleeds over. What do you think, Brendan?
So I want to go back to like Jackie Robinson and what you were saying about like we see, the color barrier be broken in baseball, and then it starts to become more acceptable in our nation. And so this is the power of sports. This is sports saying, hey, look at this story. And we start telling it, we make a big deal of it, which, maybe that's the national media going, oh, hey, this is the story we want to tell. And we start to come together and we start to work together and we start to be more acceptable of people of different races in our jobs, in our neighborhoods. And we start to like change the way we're living. That's the sports story, creating empathy. That's helping us be able to say, me too. But then you go, is it true? And I want to make a point. I was looking up when Remember the Titans was made. And the movie was made and came out in 2000. And I was in high school then. And I remember watching it and going, yeah, we have made it. This is where we are. And I think it was so good. It was such a good movie of everything coming together, people of races of different kinds joining hands. And I think that was the zeitgeist of the 1990s and the early 2000s. I could be wrong, but that was like the cultural feel of what it was like before 2001, before the Twin Towers fell and our nation changed. And so you look at that movie and it's telling a story of people coming together, and it tells us, well, maybe in the early 2000s and in the 1990s, that's what it felt like. And so you can use sports stories. You can look at movies and go, that's what the culture was like back then. That's what the type of stories were being told. Because now the type of stories we're telling are way more similar to the Colin Kaepernick type of tale, where it's fighting for your rights. It's trying to say things are not equal, and you look at the problems in society. And so we have different types of tales going on now. And then I want to go back to the 1936 Summer Olympics, because tales that came out of those Olympics are some of my favorite. And so I think of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand, where she tells the tale of Louis Zamperini, or The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown, which focuses on a bunch of boys who went to the University of Washington and joined the crew team. And Washington at that time didn't really have a very well-founded crew team. They're always fighting with Cal for the Pac, I believe it was Pac-8 championship back then. And they make it to the Olympics. And some of those boys weren't rich. For boys who fought to get into school, work their butts off while they're in school. And it tells me that maybe in the 1930s, we had this mentality of you have to do it. You just have to put up a fight, get into it, and make it no matter what, because we want to better ourselves, because they're coming out of poverty. I think that's where you can look at what giant hurdles are people overcoming. And you look at the 1930s, they were having to overcome huge economic hurdles. And so that's why I love those stories.
That's awesome. Well, we're going to ask a question as we kind of come to the end of this first part of our episode. Brendan, what is an essential piece of information we need to know about telling sports stories?
All right, here is an essential piece of information I think you need to know. There has to be doubt that the athlete, that the team will succeed. So I look at the movie Invictus, which was about the African rugby team. When I watched that, throughout the entire movie, I had no doubt they were going to succeed. That makes a lousy story. I think that goes back to what you guys were saying up at the top, that many times sports stories don't have any doubt about whether the team's going to win or not. You have to have doubt whether or not they're going to succeed, because it's got to be like a regular story where you are reading through the entire thing going, is that character going to make it or not? So that's got to happen. You have to have that doubt.
Okay. What about you, Tom?
I'm going to tell one that's one I would like to hear, and one that I think is a little more personal to me. One is I would like to see more writing and maybe a movie about Vince Lombardi, because Vince Lombardi was extremely social justice oriented. And he was the coach of the best football team of all time, arguably one of the best football teams of all time, who was very much battling against racism, actually fought and would not allow gay players to be the subject of ridicule in the NFL. And there were gay players in the 1960s, and so I think his story is a little bit undertold. I would like to hear more. Would like to hear more about Dean Smith, even though I hate North Carolina basketball.
Let's be real here.
Again, a social justice advocate, an equality advocate that you wouldn't necessarily expect. My favorite sports story is about my friend, Alan Edwards, who, and Amy may know some of this, he was a all-everything football player at Furman, and he had a massive stroke in 2013. Had no ability to take care of himself. He didn't have family who were capable of taking care of him. So this is what I think epitomizes what team and what sports are supposed to be. So the Furman Football Players Association, I am wearing their shirt today here on our podcast, took him under their wing. They are essentially funding his living expenses through former football players at Furman who either played with him or he coached them when he was a coach at Furman. They are making sure he's got a place to live, that he has enough money, and are keeping him funded, keeping up with him. Some guys will come by and take him to lunch and do different things like that. We have some guys that get him to the gym so he can work out some. He's nonverbal, so very difficult to contact him unless you go by, which takes a lot of time. But to me, that's kind of what the meaning of sports is. Mm-hmm. That team doesn't end just because the season is over. Football is a little bit unique in that every other sport you can do somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like you can play softball, you can play basketball, you can play golf, swim, whatever. When football's over, it's done, and all you have left is that team camaraderie that comes from that. And the fact that you have a group of guys that are willing to give their time and their money and their energy to do that, it makes me almost teary to think that I had an opportunity to be a part of that and that I had an opportunity to participate in that. Wow. So.
That is awesome. Well, this connection that we gain through sports stories, understanding that team never ends, the team is vital. And maybe, Tom, what I heard you say is maybe we need to tell the untold stories a little bit more. And in telling those untold stories, then, Brendan, we need to make sure it's a good story, that there's some doubt and conflict, that maybe not everything ends up peaches and cream and, the victors to the spoil, that type of thing. But sports stories help us believe that we can overcome our own challenges, stand on the podium, reach for excellence, because these stories develop discipline, joy, resilience. We become, as Brendan said, better humans.
We're pausing the conversation about sports stories here until next week. Join us then for the conclusion to this conversation about sports stories with Dr. Tom LeGrand and Brendan Scott. In the meantime, thank you for joining us in these conversations about the future of words. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It makes a big difference. Like us on Facebook too, and remember that you are welcome back to the table next week. We'll see you then.